I am glad you're here and joining us for a class in non-composting. So a few years ago, I wrote an article. It's probably been about 10 years ago now. I wrote an article on what to do if you're not composting. Because this whole notion of composting, it can get pretty treacherous, I'll use that word, in figuring out how to actually make composting happen. And so, I put a lot of thought into this over the years, and there are a bunch of things that I do here at the Urban Farm that really lead into the notion of breaking down all of the stuff that's here and putting it back into the nutrient cycle. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And if we have a little bit of time at the end, I may jump into and talk about the very basics of composting. Compost. Why compost? And really, it's the question isn't why compost, it's why break down stuff. So the why part is diversion. So if we're taking all of those things that are on our property and using them and not sending them to landfill, that's, preserving landfill space. When we actually compost, it takes some of those carbons and nitrogens and it sequesters them in the process so that it's not going anaerobic. So when things go anaerobic, that means there's no oxygen involved. And when you put stuff in a landfill, they put it in this big balloon in the ground, and ultimately oxygen can't get in and things go anaerobic and greenhouse gases are produced. That's why often at dumps and landfills you see them burning off methane gas that's coming off of that, which is a greenhouse gas. So by composting, you're diverting things. And if you're truly composting and doing all of the things that we're going to talk about tonight, you're building soil health. You're also creating compost that will retain the moisture. One of the things that we do here in the desert, and I suggest people do this everywhere, is put wood chips down in the garden, in the places in your garden where you're actually not growing vegetables. So around fruit trees and around trees and in walkways. If you put down 6 or 8 inches of wood chips, that acts as a great big sponge, and it holds on to the moisture in the soil. And at the interface between the dirt and the wood chips, very quickly you get all this microbial life that is breaking stuff down and building healthy soil at that interface. And it cools the soil. It keeps it cooler in the summer, and it keeps it warmer in the winter because it's this, basically you're putting a 6-inch insulation space, throughout your garden. It's going to cool the space. So that particular kind of composting, we'll call this wood chip composting, is a very slow kind of composting, and we'll talk about that, slow composting, here in a little while. So I just want to touch on the difference between mulch and compost, because we get this question a lot in our classes. What's the difference between compost and mulch? So mulch, in my world, is organic material that hasn't been completely broken down. When you grab a handful of it, you can still see wood chips and the components, maybe even leaves and things. You can see a propensity or a lot of that kind of stuff in the stuff you have in your hand. So I call that mulch. If you take a handful of what you think is compost and you look through it, and there might be a few small sticks left, but mostly if you see just broken down soil, that is compost. And for your garden, you only want to put compost in your garden. If you put mulch in your garden or wood chips in your garden, those wood chips and mulch, they steal the nitrogen away from your plants, and what you get are these plants that, they don't grow all that well. I had somebody send me a picture recently, here just in the past couple of days actually, of her garden, and when we looked closer at the soil that she used, it was more mulch-based than it was compost-based, and that's a problem. So just note that, the difference between mulch and compost. So tonight, though, we're talking about composting as a process, a breaking down process, and our end product is compost. So I'll make that distinction as well. And so what we're composting primarily is yard waste and kitchen scraps. And the reason that I stumbled across and started writing about this notion of non-composting a few years ago is because the composting process is quite an arduous, or can be quite an arduous process. First of all, you need 70% browns and 30% greens, and you have to understand the difference between browns and greens. And quickly, the greens are things that have recently been alive, so they could literally be green, or they could be compost, or they could be manures, or things that are high in nitrogen, and browns are high in carbon. So you need to get a good mix of greens and browns, 70-30 generally speaking, and they have to be mixed well. And by the way, you have to have a certain amount of it. If you have 10 cups or a pound of browns and greens mixed together, there's not enough mass there. There's not enough mass there to, really keep the composting process going. So what I say in the whole composting process is you need a space of materials that is at least 4 by 4 by 4. So that's a cubic yard and a half. That is a lot of material. Think 5-gallon buckets. If you think 5-gallon buckets, you're going to need about 50 5-gallon buckets of material to really effectively compost. And now I'm not telling you this to discourage you from composting. I'm telling you this so you can start thinking about the process. And so that's not what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about all those things that you can do that will expedite breaking down materials on your property, put them into the nutrient flow of your property, and what I'm going to talk about tonight really is creating a regenerative process. I'll say more about that in a little while. A regenerative process in your yard, so that you have a flow through all the way from the kitchen to the yard and back to the kitchen with nutrients. And first of all, I want you to think in whole systems. We need to start as urban farmers, as permaculturists, as gardeners, we need to think about our yard and our space as a whole system. So we're developing this whole systems thinking. And first I want you to make a list of what you already have. And I don't know that I want you to make a list of your entire project or property and what you have, but let's think about composting and the nutrient cycling at your property. And, so think about what resources that you already have in place. And then I want you to consider each of these resources or elements, its characteristics, its benefits, how they can be integrated into your farm. One of the things that I do here at the Urban Farm is I'm always considering waste and what can we do with that waste here before it leaves the property. Secondly, I'm considering waste before it ever comes into the property. So one of the things that we do here at the Urban Farm is we buy bulk. We buy things in bulk. One of my favorite things to buy in bulk is these organic chocolate chips at Whole Foods. And what I do is I save the bag from time after time after time. So I have a paper bag, and I take it to Whole Foods. It's already got the chocolate chip number written on it, and I fill it up, and I bring it home, and then I put it back in my bag and take it back the next time. So what I've just done is I've reduced a piece of waste that would normally go into the trash can. So when I say develop whole systems thinking, these are the kinds of things I'm talking about. What are all the inflows and the outflows of your property? How can you, as Bullet says, connect the dots? How can you make each of these pieces support each other? I'm going to go more in depth in this process in a minute. So right now I'm planting seeds. And remember, if you scroll down, you can shoot me questions. I see there's a bunch of you out there listening tonight. Welcome again. I've had some more people show up since the course started. So welcome, welcome. And please put your questions down below, and I will get to them here in a little while. So secondly, you want to identify the gaps. In developing this whole systems thinking, you want to identify the gaps in the system. What needs cannot be met by elements that are already in the system? So if you don't have chickens, like we do here at the Urban Farm, we have chickens. So one of the things that I get out of chickens is manure. And manure is a green. And greens make a great jump starter for compost. So if you don't have chickens, what are you going to use to jumpstart your the greens in your composting, essentially? And what can you do to attract those needs? In the case of, if you have rabbits in the neighborhood that are, coming around, they could leave some manure behind, or, get chickens. So you can, decide to get 3 chickens for your backyard. I'm a big proponent that if you have dirt in the backyard, you should have some chickens. Figure out how to do it. And identifying these gaps by planting flowers. And again, this whole systems thinking, or this circular thinking, is what I'm really pointing to. And then thirdly, in developing that, we want to be willing to make mistakes, to learn, to apply creativity, to practice patience. Listen, in my podcast with every guest, I ask them about mistakes they have made. And these mistakes that they've made along the way, this is how we learn. So jump in, be willing to make mistakes, and be willing to learn in this whole systems thinking development process. Now, these past 3 slides might seem a little vague. They're going to make a lot more sense here in the next 5 or 6 slides. So in the composting process, what we want to do is we want to employ decomposers. If you're traditionally composting, you're going to use bacteria, fungi, nematodes, protozoa, those kinds of things. If you're going to use one of the other processes, which we're going to be talking about today, you're going to use chickens or worms or soldier flies or sheet mulching. So what we want to do is employ these decomposers, and decomposers are those entities, those employees, those animals, those bugs, those things that help break down things. So one of the things that I get this a lot. People say, "Hey, I get this in March, April, and May here in the desert." And in March, April, and May, it's very hot. Somebody will call me or email me and say, "Hey, Greg, my broccoli, it's got aphids on it. What am I doing wrong?" And the only thing I can tell them what they're doing wrong at that point is, "Hey, you should have eaten your broccoli 3 months ago." Because what happens is the aphids show up at the end of the life cycle of a plant, and they start the breaking down process. And really, the notion of composting, it's a breaking down process. So here's what this whole systems thinking regenerative process looks like here for me at the urban farm. Again, thinking in whole systems, the food comes into or is raised on the property, and when we process the food at dinner, so after we make dinner tonight, Heidi and I will have some food scraps left, and they can go, on our property, they go to one of three places. They go to the chickens who create manure, they go to the worm bin who are creating worm castings for us, or they go to the soldier fly bin, and the soldier fly bin creates soldier fly grubs, and you'll see what those are here in a minute. They are amazing. And so the soldier fly grubs, they need to be eaten by something, and that something in this case at my house would be chickens, or they could be eaten by fish. So all of these three process nutrients back into the soil. And then I grow more nutrient-dense food that creates food and food scraps that start the process over again. So when I'm employing this process, I've got food waste coming into the front end of the house, or food coming into the front end of the house, food waste that goes out the back door. It goes into one of these three places. Those nutrients get processed or broken down by chickens, by a worm bin and worms, or by soldier flies, and then I use it to grow more nutrient-dense food. So if you think about it, this is a circular process. And this circular process is what you want to employ in your space. So let's talk about the different pieces that we have. So keeping chickens. Chickens are consumers of kitchen scraps. They absolutely love kitchen scraps. And the value of chickens in your space is immense. First of all, they give you eggs. Here's another slide, chickens as composters. By getting them composting, they're reducing your feed costs. They're helping you reduce your fertilizer costs because they're making manure, and we're going to talk about different ways to use that manure here in a minute. That makes composting easier. They eat pests. One of the things that my chickens do in my backyard is they mow the grass. So in the summertime, when it's, the grass is growing like mad, the chickens are out there, and they are doing an amazing job of keeping the grass mowed so that I don't have to. The chickens are happier, the gardens are healthier and more productive. So chickens as composters they're amazing. Having chickens is the first line of breakdown of compost is amazing. So one of the other things that I will often do is I'll take straw or wood chips and I'll spread them in the chicken area, especially underneath their roost, because chickens poop at night. And so what the chickens are doing is they're pooping at night onto these straw or wood chips. I rake up those wood chips periodically, and I use them in sheet mulching, which you're going to learn about here in a little while. Or if you are composting, that's another thing you can do, is you can actually put them directly. The compost or the wood chips and the manure, they mix nicely, coming right out of the chicken coop, and they can go right into the composting bin. So I'll put wood chips down, and about every 6 months, what I'll do is I'll rake up all of the detritus, all of the leftover leaves, all of the leftover pieces of food, if there are any, all the everything out of the chicken coop, and it goes right into the composting bin. And then I let it compost in that bin over 6 months, and it makes absolutely the most amazing soil. So that's, again, another way to close that loop of nutrients in your space. So chickens as composters are great. Vermicomposting or worm composting. I don't know if you know it, worm composting or vermicomposting or worm castings, as they call them, or worm poop. So what you get from vermicomposting is worm poop. And worms make great, incredible composters. They love vegetable matter. So pretty much any vegetable matter that you have left over in your kitchen, if you don't have space for a compost bin, you can have a buddy of mine, Miguel, keeps his worm bin in his apartment, worm castings, which is incredible fertilizer for your plants. It's one of the best. They call it gardener's gold. Here's the thing. Worm composting is completely different from hot composting or thermophilic composting, the thing that Kari talked about last month, and the thing that I'm kind of guiding you away from at this point. But thermophilic composting is not a place for your worms. Your compost bin, if you are doing it right, is going to get up to 161 to 165 degrees. That will kill any worms that you put in your compost bin. So compost bin is for composting. Worm bins is for vermicomposting. Really, a couple of really important points. So these are the worms. These are composting red worms. Usually you can get them around town for $10 or $15 a pound-ish. Thing is, if you get some of them and put them in a bin like this on the right, I had one of these towers once. It's actually really cool the way it works. Each one of these trays is a different layer of this worm composting. So when you start, you put some, this is cocoa peat right here. You start by putting the cocoa peat in this bin right here. Cocoa peat is coconut husks that have basically been broken down. And you put that block in there and wet it, and it expands into that space. You put your worms in that space and start putting food scraps in there, and they start processing it. And then after a month or so, and I'm sure there's directions with this particular one, after a month or so, you add the second layer, and there's holes in the bottom of these trays. So what happens is you add a second layer and you put more cocoa peat on the second layer. The worms, this is the cool part, the worms migrate up to the next layer and eat on this layer for a while. And then after a month or so, you do the same thing on the third one. You put cocoa peat on the third one and start adding food scraps up here. So after 3 or 4 months, your worms have migrated to the top. You harvest this bin right here, empty it out. You have nice worm castings in there, and then you move it to the top like that and start over again. It's a really cool, curious process, and it actually works quite well. And again, it makes these amazing worm castings. So one of the things that I want to point out on here for you is this right here. And one of the things we won't talk about tonight, but you can delve into if you like, is compost tea. And compost tea is basically or worm tea in this case. It's the water that that passes through this and collects at the bottom, and it is full of nutrients, and it is full of life. It has all kinds of mycorrhiza and bacteria and stuff that is really, really good for your soil. So what we suggest that you do is you pull that off of there and you put it on your plants. They will love you for it. They will absolutely love you for it. So this is one worm bin. I have a worm bin here at the Urban Farm, which is simply like a 12-gallon tub that I've drilled holes in the bottom. I put cocoa peat inside it, so the holes in the bottom are for water to be able to drain out, and then I just feed away. And the worms absolutely love it. And after a season, I usually go through with the bin. I go through about 1 season of worms in there, and I sort the worms out, and then I start it over again after after a 6-month season. So that's vermicomposting. Now to absolutely my favorite one. This is a soldier fly. And the soldier flies are really, really curious. So first of all, they're not like a normal fly. They actually look more like a wasp. They do not sting. I have never seen one at the house here, in the house here at the urban farm. They're solitary. They don't bug you. And this next one will show you what the inside of the soldier fly bin looks like. So they will literally eat everything. So if recently I had one of our feral cats in the yard brought home a dead rat, and I dropped the dead rat in there, and they consumed it within about 12 hours. They'll eat meat. They'll eat, pretty much anything you can put in there, they will consume. And what they're doing is they're consuming that food waste, and they're turning it. So there's 3 stages to soldier flies. There's this stage, which is the egg stage to the larval stage 1, and this is a bunch of them in there, and literally they look like this. And so in stage 1, they're eating. That's their eating stage. In stage 2, this picture here on the right, they're a grub stage. And the cool thing about soldier flies is when they get ready to go from this stage right here to this stage right here, they want to climb up and out of the muck. And I'll tell you what, this bin gets pretty dang mucky. It's basically food waste. The cool thing is that it doesn't smell that bad. There's a little bit of aroma to it, but it doesn't really smell. And they convert a lot of food waste into these grubs. And then the leftover stuff, usually what I do with the leftover stuff when I clean out the bin periodically is the chickens just get it. The chickens get to root through it, and I usually put it in an area of the yard where the chickens will root through it, and anything that's left over will fertilize the fruit trees that are underneath that. So soldier flies do make a manure, but mostly what we're after are these grubs. And as I said earlier, with the grubs, you need to have something you feed the grubs to. I feed them to our chickens. Fish love them. I'll tell you what, our chickens know I'm coming from halfway across the yard. Yeah, they're amazing. So, and I want to show you, this is a biopod. This next piece, this is a soldier fly bin that you can purchase. And I didn't bother to check how expensive they were, so I apologize. But if you type in Biopod Plus, I'm sure they're $100 to $150, and they're well worth it. And I've got 3 pictures: the whole picture here, the inside, and then the top, to show you how they work. Main lid, harvest bucket. So this is a harvest bucket here. The harvest bucket is where these grubs climb up to out of the muck. So this is what they call it the migration ramp. This is what it looks like inside. Basically what you do, and on the bottom here, there's a plate that goes on the bottom that lets the liquid drain out through the drainage port. What happens is you put the plate in the bottom. You start putting food scraps, and I usually put some cocoa peat in here as well. But you put some food scraps in here and some grubs in here, and you can buy grubs. They tell me, interestingly enough, that if you just put food scraps in one of these and wait for a few days, the soldier flies will show up. I've never tried that. But usually online you can buy some soldier fly grubs as well. The soldier flies go in through this harvest slit. They lay their eggs on the sides of this puppy here. The grubs go into the muck where the food is at. I think it takes 21 days for them to go from egg to grub that climbs out. Then what they do, when they're ready, they climb up the ramp, and through the harvesting slit into a bucket. This bucket right here. This bucket right here. You grab that bucket and take it over your chickens, and they will absolutely love you. So it really is that simple. The biggest challenge that I have found with managing my soldier flies is it can get mucky in the bottom, and if it's too dry in a soldier fly bin, you don't get them showing up. If it's too wet, their development slows way down. So there's still this balance that I'm working through after having kept them for over a year and a half now. There's still this balance that I'm trying to figure out to get the most production. But I'll tell you, out of a container this size, and this guy is, let's go back to this slide here. I'm going to guess this is 18 inches by probably 9 inches right here. On a good day, I'll get a cup and a half or 2 cups of soldier flies out of this. On a bad day, I'll get 20 or 30 of them. So, you know, once the process is started, it's pretty dang cool how it just works. A couple more things here. This kind of shows you an upper view access port, and then the perforated plate here on the bottom shows you that so that it drains out. But this is one method. There's a bunch of how-to videos on the internet you can watch. I am just about ready. I have a homemade version of this. I'm just about ready to buy one of these Biopod Pluses and have it to start trying it, because my homemade one works well, but it doesn't work great. So that is soldier flies. So one of the things that I will periodically do here at the Urban Farm is called sheet mulching. Like your bed sheets, sheet mulching, or lasagna gardening. And lasagna gardening is a process of layering. What sheet mulching is, or lasagna gardening, it is a process of layering organic matter. And you can layer that organic matter really as thick as you want. I have done layering of it as deep as 36 inches. You know, as the name would suggest, lasagna gardening, it's just a matter of making lasagna in your yard. And literally, you can use just about any green and brown you want in the process. So what you do is you start, and this shows, this is a more extensive version of sheet mulching that I do. What you can do, you can put newspaper down, you can put cardboard down. People have talked about doing that. What that does with the is it puts a barrier in place. So if there are any weed seeds on the ground, those weed seeds, when they germinate, they'll hit that cardboard and they'll die. So that's the reason to put newspaper or cardboard down. And on this thing, it says a small layer of manure underneath. You can even put soil amendments underneath it, so on and so on. And all that stuff will break down. Here is the thing about sheet mulching and lasagna gardening. If you have a noxious weed, and you sheet mulch over it, and when I say noxious weed, I mean Bermuda or nutgrass. If you are sheet mulching over that noxious weed, you will get that noxious weed coming up through. I don't care if you put cardboard down or not. It is going to come up through. So if you're dealing with a noxious weed like Bermuda or nutgrass, you have to get that gone out of your garden before you sheet mulch, or you're going to have a very nice garden full of Bermuda and nutgrass that comes up through the sheet mulching. That being said, if you just have a few weeds, you can cover them up with cardboard and leave them underneath. They'll break down very nicely. And then what you do on top of that is you start layering. Dry matter, so browns in this case. I've used alfalfa hay, which Actually, in some cases, alfalfa hay has enough nitrogen in it to be considered a green, so it'll help the breakdown process. But I've used leaves. One of the things that I love to do this time of year in the fall is take the leftover Jerusalem artichoke tops or anything that's left over from the summer, corn stalks, sunflower stalks, all of that kind of stuff, that can be put on as a bottom layer along with some leaves. Also this time of year in the fall, I'm looking for the neighbors to throw out their leaves, because I want those leaves, number one, for the chickens and for them to root through, and number two, for sheet mulching. So you want to put down a nice layer of browns, and usually I usually do about 4 to 6 inches. And then I'll stop and I'll add a thin layer of manure of some kind of green on the top. You can use green weeds if you've just recently cut green weeds. Now, realize that if you use weeds in a sheet mulch bed and they have seeds on them, you're going to get weeds coming up through. So I've even bought organic fertilizer by the bag, and I've used that for sheet mulching. So basically what you're doing is you're doing a layer of brown, you're putting a little bit of green or manure or that kind of stuff on top of it, then another layer of brown, and I have literally sheet mulched up to 36 inches thick before. And what happens is very quickly over time, that 36 inches breaks down to a couple of inches of really, really nice soil. Basically, you're making a really, really great layer of amazing soil. So this is a great way to over time, build some healthy soil in place. This is the same thing that happens with the wood chip mulch that I mentioned earlier. You just can't grow vegetables in it. This is designed specifically to get your garden jump-started so that you can get some great soil growing. Yeah, and, get great soil going. I guess that's all I have to say about that. So I'm going to jump over. I am ready to take questions.